Hi everybody, this is Rob Windsor, and in this SharePoint developer video, I want to show you a framework I've been working on that enables you to build web parts using JavaScript only. I started working on this about a year ago, not consistently obviously, and I got to a certain point and then I ran into a couple roadblocks, the biggest being how to persist custom property values for the web part. I wasn't able to find a good solution. And then I kind of put the work aside and got busy with other things and really left it for a long time. And then a short time ago, a friend of mine named Mark Anderson posted a link to this blog post by Rachid, and I'm not going to try to pronounce Rachid's last name because I'll probably mess it up. So, but there you can see it on the screen. And Rachid was doing something very similar to what I was trying to do. So I read through this, and one of the biggest things I got out of this blog post was how Rachid uses the native persistence mechanism for the script editor web part to be able to persist custom property values. So I continued on with my implementation of the framework and got it going, and I'm actually quite happy with the state it's in right now. So I'll be showing you my implementation, but definitely a couple of ideas come from Rachid's blog post here. And again, it's just build custom web part properties with JSOM. I'll post a link to this blog post later on in the video. All right, so now let's come over to the site I'll be using for testing. It's this developer site. And in this site, I have a few custom lists. And the two that are important are the categories list, here with these 8 categories, and the products list that has a lookup on the categories list. So each category each product belongs to a specific category. And if you've been doing .NET development for a while, you might notice this is the Northwind sample database or data. What I've done is written a utility that takes the data from that database and builds lists in SharePoint. Now, I'm not doing this using BCS. I'm actually creating lists in the site. Now, if we go to the site contents and site pages here, I have a web part page I've created called test. And on this page, I have a web part that I've created with JavaScript. So here is the label categories and a select that has the names of each of the categories. And when I choose a category, it goes to the products list, gets the first 10 products in that category, and shows them here in this table. Now, if we take a look at this web part, it is a script editor web part. I'm talking about building web parts using JavaScript only. You can't build ASP.NET web parts without managed code, so I have to use one of the built-in web parts. And really, my only two choices were the content editor and the script editor. I started out using the content editor, but once reading Rachid's blog post, I realized that we can use the native persistence mechanism of the script editor. So now the web parts are built in this fashion. Now, if we take a look inside of the script editor, we won't see the HTML that implements the web part. All we'll see is a div, and this div is just a container that will end up filling with the UI and eventually the JavaScript that implements the web part. And this div has two attributes. One is a class attribute that's been set to ps-script part. We'll talk more about that later on. And then another attribute called data-part-name, which is set to product browser 01. This is the name of two files I have in my project. One is an HTML file, and one is a JavaScript file. So let's come over and take a look at the project that implements the web part. And that's this guy here, script web parts 2. And here I have a module which provisions a virtual folder that contains HTML and JavaScript files. And there you can see the product browser 01 HTML and product browser 01 JS that I referred to. So this is the UI for our web part. And effectively, this is the code behind for our web part. So taking a look at product browser 1 HTML, Here is the categories dropdown. And then here is the placeholder for the products table. And this placeholder gets filled by data binding the data coming back from the products list to this template using knockout. So I do the data binding that generates the table, and then I inject the table inside of this div. Right, so that's the UI. And then over here, we have the code behind. So the code behind is a class named ProductBrowser01 that lives in a namespace, pluralsight.scriptparts. And the constructor for this class takes in a web part ID as a parameter. So I store that in a field, and then I go get a reference to the element that has the class ms-wp body and the attribute value of the web part ID. This element is the container element for my web part. So I'm going to scope any finds I do to that element. That way, if I have multiple instances of this web part on a page, I make sure that I have containment for each of the individual instances of the web part. Then there's a method called Initialize, which basically initializes the category dropdown. So I go and get the categories. When that asynchronous call completes, I then populate the dropdown. And I also attach the change event handler here to call category select change. And then in category select change, I go and get the ID from the dropdown, the selected ID from the dropdown. And then I go and get the products. Once that asynchronous call completes, I then go and get the template for our table, and I data bind to the template and inject that into the div for the products in our UI. The remainder of the code in the class here just makes the asynchronous calls to get the categories using the REST API, and the asynchronous call to get the products, again, using the REST API. So just to review, we have the web part, and it has an attribute called data-part-name that's set to ProductBrowser01. And then in our project, we have ProductBrowser01 HTML. That's the UI for the web part. And ProductBrowser01.js. That is the code behind for the web part. Now, we haven't seen any code that actually loads these files or does anything to initialize the web part. Well, that's all in this file called Script Part Manager. So here in Script Part Manager, at the top I have some comments that talk about Rachid's blog post. And then in the jQuery onload function, I'm going to go ahead and wait for SPJS to be loaded. That's the client object model. And once that happens, I'll go create an instance of this class called Script Part Manager that lives in the pluralsight.scriptparts namespace. I'll store a reference to that right off the root of the namespace so it becomes a singleton implementation. And then I'll call this method initialize script parts. So we'll worry about the isEditor-open piece a little bit later on. I'm going to focus on this piece here where the editor is not open. So what I'm going to do here is find all of the elements that have the class name ps-scriptpart. And recall, when we come back to our page here, our div has that class, ps-scriptpart. And then for each of those, I'm going to call this method called initializeScriptPart, passing in the div that's contained inside of the script editor. So that's a reference to this div here. So in initializeScriptPart, the first thing I'm going to do is get the value of the data-part-name attribute. And then I'm also going to get the web part ID associated with the web part. Then what I want to do is get the HTML for the web part. That's what getPartContents does. It uses an AJAX get to go read the HTML file out of the SharePoint virtual file system. And once that's complete, it pushes the HTML from the HTML file into the div that's inside of the script editor. So that represents our UI. What about the code behind and what about the JavaScript code behind? Well, that's what getPart class does. So in getPart class, again, I use an AJAX call. I'm using the jQuery getScript method to go and get the JS file associated with the web part and also load that JavaScript. And what getPart class returns is a variable that represents the constructor for the web part. So we come back over to product browser 1.js. That's basically a variable that represents this guy. Remember, functions in JavaScript are objects. I can have a variable which represents the object. So func is basically a reference to this function when I come out of getPart class. Since I have a reference to the constructor, I can then new up an instance of this object by calling new on the constructor and passing in the web part ID. And then by convention, I'll assume that all of the web part classes have a method called initialize to run the initialization for the web part, basically set up the UI. And recall, going back to our product browser 01, it does have an initialize method. So just to review, when the script part manager starts up, it goes and finds all of the elements with the PS script part class. It iterates through those elements. For each of those elements, it finds the data part name attribute and the web part ID of the containing web part element. It retrieves the contents for the web part, the UI, and pushes that into the web parts div. Then it loads the JavaScript for the web part, gets a reference to the function that's the constructor for the class, creates a new instance of that class, and calls the initialize method. So when I come back to here and get out of edit mode, the initialize has been called. We've loaded the UI. We've loaded the JavaScript. That's populated the dropdown. Then when I choose an item here, the event handler we attach to the dropdown runs, and we go get the products. We data bind to the table using knockout, and we inject the data bound table into our UI. Now, in the intro, I said I was having problems with custom property values. I haven't shown you anything about custom property values yet. Let's take a look at that. I'll put the page into edit mode, and I'll change our div slightly here. Okay, so now we have the data-part-name being product browser 02. And then we have a new attribute, data-part-properties. And in here I have the JSON for an object who has two properties, one being number, which is currently set to 10, and one being category ID, which is currently set to 7. Category ID here is the ID of the selected category in the categories list. All right, so if I just get out of the zoom mode here and then save the changes to the script editor web part and then stop editing, now we can see that we have only the products table. There is no more categories drop down in this view. And the category ID being 7 says show the items that are part of the produce category. But in this version of the web part, I can put the page into edit mode, go into edit web part properties, and over here in the editor, I'm going to have a section called custom properties, and here's where I can edit the number and the category. So our number was 10. I'm only using number here to demonstrate how to have multiple properties. Number has no no significance to the web part itself. But let's set the number to 250. And let's change the category from produce to condiments. And then click OK. And then stop editing. Now we can see our table is showing condiments. And if I put the page into edit mode and edit the snippet, we can see here that the number has been changed to 250 and the category has been changed to 2. That's the category associated with condiments. So the question now becomes, how do we get the web part editor to show the new category, the editors for our properties, and then how do we save the updated property values back into the web part? So let's come back over to our project here and to our script manager. And recall that after we created an instance of the script manager, the first thing we do is call initialize script parts. And then the first thing we do inside of initialize script parts is check to see, is the page in edit mode? And we can do this by checking if for the presence of certain variables, for the presence of certain elements with certain classes, and so on. So if we determine that the editor is open, then we'll call this method called initialize toolpane. So scrolling down to initialize toolpane here, there's editor open there, and then down here is initialize toolpane. So in here we'll parse out the web part ID. We'll get a reference to the script part element. The script part element is this div inside of our script part editor, web part. Sorry, script editor web part. And then we'll go and get the current state of the web part properties, assuming there are some. If there aren't any, we just bail. But if we do have web part properties, we continue on. The next thing we do is get the name of the HTML and JavaScript files associated with this web part. And then we get a link to our reference to the constructor for the code behind. So here we create an instance of the code behind class, but this time, instead of calling initialize, we call this method called getPropertyEditors. So getPropertyEditors returns us an array of objects. Those objects represent information about the editor controls we want to inject inside of what's called the editor zone, the area where we edit web part properties in SharePoint. So this editors will be an array, and then we'll loop through the array and add those editor controls into the toolpane. So let's take a look at getPropertyEditors from our code behind class. Coming back to our code behind here, here is the getPropertyEditors method. And the first thing we do here is call getCategories to get the categories, because we're going to need that data to build up a drop-down in a second. Once that's completed, then we'll create an array, which will return from here to represent the information that the script part manager needs to render our editors. And each of the objects in this array will have this form: the name of the property being edited, the caption that will go above the editor control that we show in the editor zone, and then a string representing the markup for the actual editor itself. So for number, the caption above the number control will be number, and the control will be this input element. And then for the category, the caption will be category, and the control will be this select element, which we build up here. So coming back to the script part manager, we get the array, and then we call add editors to toolpane. Now, this looks kind of nasty, but basically what this is doing is basically generating a whole bunch of HTML. And the HTML we're generating here matches the HTML that's generated for a standard category inside of the editor zone. So if I go back to edit web part, right, this whole thing is called the editor zone, and each of these is called a category. So if we were to inspect the HTML associated with this top area here that allows expand and collapse, and each one of these things, we would see HTML that looks a lot like the HTML that's being generated here. I'm not going to go through all of the gory details of it. So this top part here is adding in the header. That's this bit here that allows expand and collapse. And then this bit down here is added by looping through the editor objects we got passed back from the call to the code behind for the class, and injecting the caption for the editor object and the editor control into certain divs that are required by the editor zone. So the combination of get property editors inside of the classes code, the web part code behind classes implementation, and then the calls here inside the script part manager are what render the UI that shows here. So that covers how to render the UI. The next part we need to figure out is how to save any changes made by the user. So let's change number to 300, and let's change the category to beverages, and then click OK. Now remember, we're using the native persistence mechanism of the script editor web part. So what happens is when you change the property values of a script editor web part, and then you click OK or Apply, SharePoint will inject a hidden element into your page. So if we scroll down here, I can find that hidden element and show it to you. It's the one here near the top of our page. So you see hidden, and then the name is the GUID. That's the ID for the web part plus the word script content. And then the ID here is also the GUID for the web part ID with script content. And then inside of here, basically the value attribute is the HTML that's going to go into the script editor. So this HTML contains the property values for our web part, right? So there you can see the category ID. 300 is the value for the number. So there you can see data part properties, and then number, 300, and then our category ID, and that's set to 1. Okay, so what the code does is it listens for a click, or it attaches event handlers for the click or the OK or apply button. It goes and finds this hidden element, and it updates the contents of the value attribute to contain our new property values. So let's come back to the script editor web part, take a look at, or the script manager, and see how that's done. So down here at the bottom of the add editors to tool pane method, we have a call to attach save event handlers. And then in this method call, we go and find the elements for the apply button and the OK button. We attach a click event handler to both of these, where we call save part properties, passing in the web part ID and the part name. Remember, the part name is the name of the file, the HTML and JavaScript file associated with the web part. In save part properties, we go and we find inside of the editor zone any element with the class name PS property editor. If we come back to the code behind for our web part, notice when we're generating the markup for our property editors, I'm setting that class name, both here and here. So I'll loop through those elements and get the actual property values. So I'll find the property name. That's an attribute called data property name. Coming back over here. data property name is the name of the name of the custom property. So this one is number, and this one is category ID. And then I'll ask the HTML element, or really here I'll ask jQuery, what is the value of that element? And then I'll add a new property to this class, which is the property name, and the value of that property will be the property value. And then down here, what I'll do is I'll go and rebuild the HTML that goes into the script editor web part. So basically, I'm rebuilding, and not this, I'm rebuilding this div completely with the class, with the data, this class, the div, the class, this attribute, and this attribute. But I'm going to put in the new values for the properties. That's what I'm doing there. Then finally, I'll go find the hidden element that we saw earlier, and I'll set its value property to this HTML. So coming back to SharePoint, here again, I'll go into edit mode. I'll change this to 100 and seafood. Click OK. On the click of OK, I went and rebuilt the HTML for the script editor, saved it into the value property of the hidden HTML element. Now, when we leave edit mode, SharePoint will then take the contents of that hidden, or the contents of the value attribute of that hidden HTML element. It will push it into the script editor web part and also persist it in the SharePoint content database. So again, if I go take a look at the snippet here, you can see the snippet has our new property values. Number being 100 and category being 8. 8 is the item ID for the item in the categories list, which is seafood. Right? But if I leave this page completely, so let me just close this down and then navigate back to our SharePoint site, go to site contents, go to site pages here, and go to test. You can see we're still showing seafood because the attributes on the element inside of the script editor have been persisted into the content database. So again, we're using the native persistence mechanism of the SharePoint script editor web part. So just a couple of final things in the implementation of this project. In addition to the script parts virtual directory, I have a virtual directory called scripts. And in there I have jQuery 1.9.1 and Knockout 3.1. I have a couple of custom actions which load jQuery, Knockout, and my script manager. The feature that contains all of these elements is a site collection scope feature. So these files are all available in the root of, or made available in the root of the site collection where the feature is activated. And finally, I mentioned I'd have some links for you. So let me open up Notepad here and paste those in. So here is a link, the full link and the short link to the Rachid's blog post. And then here's a link to the materials for a talk I have called Advanced SharePoint Web Part Development. The project you see here, Script Web Parts 2, is part of the download you can get in my OneDrive. I would like to note that, I feel the state of the framework is pretty good at this point, but there's a lot to still be done. I don't really have intense error checking in there. I don't have any logging in there. There's a lot of things that need to be added to make it production ready. But it's good. I think it's good as a reference implementation. So hopefully you find this valuable. I think there's a place for SharePoint apps or add-ins and also Azure add-ins But I also think there's places where it makes sense to build into SharePoint and give users things they're familiar with, like web parts. When we're talking about SharePoint Online, especially with the fact that sandbox solutions with code have been deprecated, the only real way I see to future-proof building web parts is to build them in this manner, where we build everything with JavaScript and we use one of the built-in web parts to host that JavaScript.